He bought an inexpensive ranch at auction, but it came with an unexpected bonus: a wife. But before we delve into the story, don't forget to like this video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The road leading west from Bridger Post was pure dust and silence. There was no sign, no stakes, just dry posts and the same hard brown earth stretching as far as the eye could see. The sun had already set, casting a dull golden glow over the plain. Cade Mercer rode with her head down and the collar of her coat turned up to protect herself from the wind. Her horse, a sturdy sorrel with tired eyes, moved slowly but steadily. Neither man nor beast was in a hurry. Cade hadn't said a word since they left town. There was no need to. Everything important was written on the deed tucked inside his saddlebag. It comprised 42 acres of dry scrub, a ranch house in near ruins, a collapsing barn, and a fence that the auctioneer had described as more or less imaginary. He paid less than most people spend on feed in a good year. The price didn't add up. McCade didn't ask questions. He wasn't one for idle chatter, and no one in town had the courage to warn him, even if they wanted to. Cade Mercer was 33 years old, tall with a broad back, and he carried a silence that made others step aside when they saw him coming. His thin, weather-beaten face was marked more by the sun than by age, bearing the hardness that comes from poor sleep and heavy memories. He had worked with cattle, fought in skirmishes on the frontier, and lived with men whose names he preferred to forget. He had lost a brother to fever, and a friend had been treacherously killed in New Mexico. He never spoke of those years, not even to himself. The only things that mattered to him were the present: a piece of land, a roof to repair, and perhaps a little peace if he earned it. He reached the last hill shortly before sunset. The ranch lay nestled between two barren hills. The fence around the front pasture leaned as if it had already given up. The crooked gate hung open. The single-story house, with plank walls and a barely standing chimney, had patches of paint here and there, but not enough to hide the wear and tear. The porch roof had collapsed on one side. An overturned, rusty wheelbarrow lay next to the steps. Further back, the barn stood half-covered in shadows, its doors ajar. Cade pulled on the reins and remained motionless and silent. He scanned the area with the alertness of a soldier, looking for any signs of movement. It wasn't just a habit, it was instinct. Quiet places weren't always empty. Disembarking stiffly due to his aching left knee, he tied the reins to the porch post and took a small roll of papers out of his coat. The title was still there, signed by him. The house could wait. The priority was to check the barn.
The air changed as soon as he entered. It was cooler and still. It smelled of sweat and something else. Soap and skin. He stood still. Then he heard it. The slightest brush of a body against the wood. He held his breath. It wasn't an animal. He moved forward slowly, his boots making no sound on the earth until he saw her. She was crouched next to a box in the corner, half hidden behind bales of hay. Her back was to him. A blanket was wrapped loosely around her shoulders, revealing a worn muslin dress. Her bare legs below the knee were covered in dirt. She didn't move. "Stand up," he said firmly, but without shouting. She obeyed. Mylene. He still didn't know her name, but that was how she had been for 26 years. Her tangled auburn hair fell in waves down her back. Her face turned slowly towards him. Her eyes were hard and alert, showing no panic or pleading, just readiness. The dress was too light for autumn and torn at the seams, revealing more than most men would ignore through the opening at the neck. The fabric outlined her chest, leaving no doubt as to her figure. Another tear on the side revealed part of her thigh as she moved, but she didn't cover herself. She explained. She just looked him straight in the eye. "I knew someone would come," she said in a rough voice, worn out from disuse. "I didn't think it would be today." He narrowed his eyes at her. "You've been living in the barn since June." "Since my husband was trampled," she turned to Linnell. She had no claim to the house and no money to leave with, so she stayed where no one cared about her. Her face remained steady. There were no tremors or drama, just facts. Cade studied her. She wasn't emaciated, but she wasn't soft either. Tough and sharp. She looked like someone who had fought to stay alive. She carried water and traded it for leftovers. She did what she could without begging. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mylene." He nodded. "No one told me about you." She smiled emptily, without bitterness. "They wouldn't." "I bought this land." "I know. I didn't buy you. I know that too." She stood up a little, as if ready for him to throw her out. "I'll leave if you want me to," she added, "but I have nowhere to go, and I'm not looking for pity." Silence fell. The screech of a hawk on the hill and the wind pounding against the barn roof could be heard. Cade looked at her for a long time. He thought about the empty house and the cold nights to come, and the fact that she had never begged. "Do you know how to cook?" he asked at last. She blinked. "Yes, there are beans in the bag. I'll light a fire." She nodded. Without hesitation and without showing any relief, she just got going. She walked barefoot into the yard, calmly and steadily. He followed her with his eyes. Every instinct told him that he hadn't asked for this problem. He had bought the ranch to be alone and leave the dead he carried behind. But the way she stood there silently, raw yet proud, prevented him from kicking her out. This time the house creaked as she entered. The door scraped against the warped wood before closing. Mylene walked straight to the stove without saying a word, her body rigid from endurance. Kate stood in the doorway, watching her move around the space as if she already knew it, not as an owner, but as someone who had learned to make herself invisible in places that no longer belonged to her. She found the iron pot on a low shelf. She ran her hand over it to remove dust and traces of rats. It was clean enough. She looked at it uncertainly for a moment. "I need water," she said. "The pump is out the back." "I know." She left again without waiting for permission. Cade followed her with his eyes, but did not speak. She kept her coat and hat on. He hadn't settled in yet. He still didn't know what this place meant to him. The ranch was supposed to be a solitary refuge, far from anyone who asked about or remembered the past. What he hadn't expected was to find someone already living in its ruins, let alone her. He scanned the interior of the cabin while she was still busy outside. There was a table, 2 chairs, a bed frame without a mattress, and a crooked shelf nailed above the stove. The windows were barely holding together. The air inside was stale, carrying the sour smell of months of abandonment, with no fire or food. He checked the empty cupboard in the corner. Not even weevils. A few minutes later, she returned, panting, holding the bucket full of water in both hands. She poured the water into the pot and bent down to light a match. As she did so, the thin fabric of Mylene's dress tightened across her chest, marking her shoulders and breasts. The worn collar hung down, exposing her flushed skin, warmed by the cold outside. She didn't adjust it either, showing her sorrow. Cade looked away and got to work untying her from the forge next to the stove. He handed her a small bag containing dried beans and a little salt, and nothing else. "It's no big deal," he said. "I've lived with less," she replied, not with compassion, but with certainty. She stirred silently, waiting for the water to boil. The fire crackled slowly, bringing warmth back to the room for the first time in months. After a while, she broke the silence. "Are you from around here?" "No, it doesn't seem so. I passed through once years ago." She nodded. That was enough. He leaned against the back wall with his arms crossed. "You said your husband died in June?" She took a while to answer. Her jaw clenched as she stirred the beans. A horse kicked him. He fell badly. His neck snapped. The town didn't help you. They only helped to put him in the ground. That was all." Her voice didn't break. With no family and no claim to the house, she decided to hide out in the barn. She thought that if she stayed in the barn, no one would come looking for her, And she was right. "Why didn't you go to church?" She shrugged. "I tried. The pastor said that God helps those who help themselves." Her lips tightened. She said nothing about women without surnames or coins. Cade didn't comment. He was familiar with that kind of rejection. The water was already simmering slowly, releasing thin steam. The smell of brine and starch filled the room. She served 2 plates and handed him his with both hands. As he took it, their fingers brushed unintentionally, just a touch. They sat at the table, chewing without speaking. The food was bland but hot, and that was enough. He looked at her over the rim of his bowl. In the light of the fire, the bruise on her arm looked old, and her hands were rough and weathered. She was no stranger to hard work. He thought about how much she must have endured, sleeping in a barn like an animal. He wondered if anyone had spoken to her tenderly since spring. She noticed his gaze, but did not move. "Are you still thinking of throwing me out?" she asked quietly. "No, of course not. Do you work? You don't ask for anything. That's enough." She watched him for a long moment, not as a woman calculating her safety, but as someone who wanted to know if he would change when winter came. He held her gaze. "Do you have family?" "Not anymore. The war had something to do with it." She nodded. That was enough. They finished in silence, then she collected the dishes and rinsed them with the remaining water. She didn't ask where she could sleep. She went straight to the door with the quilt under her arm. He didn't stop her, but when she reached for the doorknob, he said, "Can you use the bed tonight? I'll sleep on the floor." She stopped and turned slightly. "I've been in the barn for months. It doesn't bother me. It's cold." "Me too. I'm out of skin." She studied him. He didn't blink. Finally, she walked over to the bed, spread out the quilt, and sat on the edge. Her shoulders relaxed, not in defeat, but in relief. It wasn't trust yet, but it was rest. The first time in a long time. He lay down by the fire on the wooden floor, in his coat, staring at the ceiling, while the wind blew outside like a dry sigh. They didn't speak again that night, but for the first time in months, neither of them slept entirely alone. Dawn came cold and slow. A gray light seeped through the crooked cracks in the walls, illuminating Cade's face and pulling him from his light sleep. His back ached from his stiff hip, but he didn't complain. He never did. With effort, he got up and crossed over to the extinguished hearth. Everything was still silent. He looked towards the bed. Merlin was still asleep, tucked up in bed with her back to him. Her reddish hair fell in waves onto the pillow. One shoulder was bare. Her dress had fallen way to reveal the soft curve of her breast. Last night, the fire had cast her in shadow. Now the light made her seem fragile. She was breathing calmly. He gazed at her for just a moment. Long enough. Then he left, closing the door behind him. The cold air cut through him as he stepped outside. The cold air announced that winter was upon them. He pumped water, the metal creaking with each pull, then carried the bucket into the house and left it by the entrance. He didn't wake her, let her rest. When she emerged from the room barefoot, with her hair in a loose braid and her dress wrinkled, Cade had already lit the fire and put the coffee on to boil. She looked at him for a moment, then walked silently to the sink. She washed her face slowly, holding onto the wall with one hand and passing a damp cloth over her cheeks. He didn't look away. She knew he was watching her, but she didn't cover up or hurry. She had learned that shame neither feeds nor warms you. Breakfast was just coffee and stale bread. She spoke first. "You have tools in the barn, most of them rusty. I can fix the windows today. The one at the back is loose. You know what I've had to learn." Cade nodded. "That's enough." When she left, he watched her walk across the yard. Her steps were cautious on the dry grass, her arms crossed against the wind. Her dress clung to her hips, and the tear in the hem revealed her lower thigh with every movement. It wasn't intentional, it just was. Cade forced his gaze away, saddled the horse, and went to check the fences. Several posts were down and others were leaning. It would take days to repair them, especially if it rained or snowed. He worked steadily, his muscles tense from old scars and a troublesome knee, but the rhythm kept him calm. It was better than thinking.
Returning shortly before noon, he found Malene on a short ladder next to the house, adjusting a board onto the back window frame. Her hair was tied back with a piece of cloth, and her arms were stained with dust. Her dress had ridden up slightly as she stretched, lowering the neckline enough to reveal the rounded shape of her breast. She didn't seem to notice, or simply didn't care. "You're gonna fall if you lean like that," he said. She looked down at him. "Then hold me." He blinked. A slight smile touched his lips, the first hint of humor he had seen. "Do you always fix your windows yourself?" he asked, approaching her. "I've never had a man to do it before. I don't expect to have one now. I am not looking for a man, nor am I asking for one." The conversation died there, though something lingered in the air. It wasn't tension, but rather a silent acknowledgement, a kind of understanding that needed no words. As dusk fell, the wind picked up and the fire burned brighter. Malene prepared a thick stew with dried beans and small onions that he had found by the south fence. They ate at the table again, barely speaking, listening to the wind howling outside. Cade's leg aches returned to her. The bruise on his arm had almost faded, but new red marks crisscrossed the tops of his bare feet. He hadn't asked for boots, or anything else. "Did you keep sleeping in that barn before I got here?"
Every night. No problems with the animals, just a raccoon and a snake. You think I was scared? She hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. It didn't make me angry or scared. He watched her from across the table. Why would I be angry? Because he left me with nothing. Because people saw me as less than a stray. And because I let it happen. I stayed silent for too long. Her voice didn't tremble. On the contrary, it sounded firmer and more solid than ever. "You had no choice," Cade murmured. "Maybe I didn't," she replied. "But now I do have a choice." He nodded once. Simple, clear respect. When they had finished eating, she washed the dishes while he fed the fire. The cabin felt warmer, not just because of the heat, but also because of the routine and familiarity of two people learning to share the same space without getting in each other's way. She paused in the doorway with the quilt in her arms. Her voice was low. "I'll sleep on the floor tonight." "You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." He didn't argue. He put a pillow next to the fireplace and spread another blanket on the floor. She settled into the corner near the fire. He watched her as she slowly lay down on her side. The loose neckline of her dress slipped down again, revealing the curve of her breast, before she pulled the blanket halfway over herself. Not out of modesty, but because she was cold. She looked at him, speechless and expecting nothing. He sat down against the wall near the fire. They remained like that for a long time, both staring at the flames. Without meaning to, Cad found himself thinking something he hadn't allowed himself to think in years. Maybe this place wasn't a burden. Maybe she wasn't a burden. Maybe it was the beginning of something worth keeping. By the time Marilyn moved, Cade was already outside. The light coming through the cracks was soft and gray, barely tinting the frost on the tall grass. The air was colder than the night before. It bit at any exposed skin, but it wasn't a cold that would stop work. Rather, it forced you to move slowly at first, and then steadily. She got up from the corner by the stove, still wrapped in the quilt. Her body ached, but it was the good kind of pain that comes from having done something useful the day before. The fire was low. She added a few twigs, stoked the embers, and waited for the fire to pick up again. There was another blanket folded on the untouched bed. She hadn't touched it, even though he had left it for her. Outside, she heard the axe crack twice, followed by silence. She went to the bathroom, washed quickly, pulled her hair into a tighter braid, and went out barefoot. Cade was standing by the edge of the cabin with a growing pile of firewood beside him. His coat was open at the chest, and his shirt was damp with sweat at the neck. He swung the axe in clean motions, his arms tense and his shoulders firm with each blow. He stopped. When he saw her, he didn't speak. He just handed her a split log. She took it without hesitation, carried it to the pile, and returned for another. They worked like this for half an hour, without orders or conversation, just rhythm. When the pile was full, he broke the silence. "You're going to ruin your feet here without boots. She looked down at her red, cold, dirty fingers. "They've held up so far. That's not the point. You have plenty to spare." "No, but I'll get you some. Are you planning on going to town?" He hesitated. "Maybe later." She crossed her arms. "What do you think I'm doing here, Cade?" He stared at her. Besides fixing her windows and sleeping on the floor, what else was he supposed to do? "Do you think I'm waiting for you to ask me for something?" "I don't know what you're waiting for." Milene nodded, her jaw clenched. She turned and walked back to the cabin. He didn't follow her. Later, after making breakfast and leaving a plate on the table without saying a word, she went into the barn. The loft where she slept was still intact, with her things in a backpack in the corner. She stood there, looking at it for a long time. Part of her still didn't trust the roof above her head or the man who had allowed her to sleep under it. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because men always changed. She had experienced that before. Her husband had also been charming. He used to tell her that she was beautiful and strong. He promised her, "I'll never let you go hungry." Then the cows died. The bottle took its place, and his words turned into blows and silence. She didn't yet know what kind of man Cade Mercer was, but so far he hadn't asked her for anything. This unsettled her more than if he had. Men who ask for nothing are the hardest to figure out. That afternoon, he saddled the horse and left without saying where he was going. She didn't ask, he didn't explain. He returned before nightfall, carrying a bundle containing some old second-hand boots tied together with a rope. He handed them to her at the door. "They're too big," she said, trying them on. They were the only pair available and were stuffed with rags. He nodded briefly. "They'll keep you warm." "I didn't ask you for them." "I know." She held his gaze for longer than usual. That night she cooked again. This time it was a thicker stew with pieces of meat he had brought. The aroma filled the cabin, making it feel like a home rather than just a shelter. She served the dish in front of him and sat down without speaking. Halfway through the meal, she leaned back and asked quietly, "Have you lost someone?" He looked up. "You don't talk about it, but you can tell." He didn't answer. She didn't press him. She just waited. Finally, he said, "My brother. He was younger. He got sick. There wasn't much I could do." 5 years ago? She nodded. "That's why you live like this." "I don't really live. I just stay out of the way." She stirred the broth. "That's not living." He frowned. "And what do you call what you do?" She smiled wearily. "Surviving." The room fell silent again. Once the dishes were clean and the fire had died down, she paused at the door to the room. This time she didn't pick up the quilt or walk to the stove.
He bought an inexpensive ranch at auction, but it came with an unexpected bonus: a wife. But before we delve into the story, don't forget to like this video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The road leading west from Bridger Post was pure dust and silence. There was no sign, no stakes, just dry posts and the same hard brown earth stretching as far as the eye could see. The sun had already set, casting a dull golden glow over the plain. Cade Mercer rode with her head down and the collar of her coat turned up to protect herself from the wind. Her horse, a sturdy sorrel with tired eyes, moved slowly but steadily. Neither man nor beast was in a hurry. Cade hadn't said a word since they left town. There was no need to. Everything important was written on the deed tucked inside his saddlebag. It comprised 42 acres of dry scrub, a ranch house in near ruins, a collapsing barn, and a fence that the auctioneer had described as more or less imaginary. He paid less than most people spend on feed in a good year. The price didn't add up. McCade didn't ask questions. He wasn't one for idle chatter, and no one in town had the courage to warn him, even if they wanted to. Cade Mercer was 33 years old, tall with a broad back, and he carried a silence that made others step aside when they saw him coming. His thin, weather-beaten face was marked more by the sun than by age, bearing the hardness that comes from poor sleep and heavy memories. He had worked with cattle, fought in skirmishes on the frontier, and lived with men whose names he preferred to forget. He had lost a brother to fever, and a friend had been treacherously killed in New Mexico. He never spoke of those years, not even to himself. The only things that mattered to him were the present: a piece of land, a roof to repair, and perhaps a little peace if he earned it. He reached the last hill shortly before sunset. The ranch lay nestled between two barren hills. The fence around the front pasture leaned as if it had already given up. The crooked gate hung open. The single-story house, with plank walls and a barely standing chimney, had patches of paint here and there, but not enough to hide the wear and tear. The porch roof had collapsed on one side. An overturned, rusty wheelbarrow lay next to the steps. Further back, the barn stood half-covered in shadows, its doors ajar. Cade pulled on the reins and remained motionless and silent. He scanned the area with the alertness of a soldier, looking for any signs of movement. It wasn't just a habit, it was instinct. Quiet places weren't always empty. Disembarking stiffly due to his aching left knee, he tied the reins to the porch post and took a small roll of papers out of his coat. The title was still there, signed by him. The house could wait. The priority was to check the barn.
You stayed when you could have left. You worked. You made this place livable. I didn't do that. She finally looked at him. Her gray eyes were tired and uncertain. I don't want pity, Kate. I need to feel like I'm worth something, not just to you, but to anyone. I haven't felt that in a long time. His chest tightened. He wanted to say more, but he couldn't find the words. He took a step toward her, closing the distance, but without touching her. You're worth more than you think, he said, even if you can't see it yet. She didn't cry, but something in her expression cracked. The corner of her mouth trembled, as if she were about to speak, but she didn't. She turned and walked back to the house. That same day, they worked together on the south fence. Kaide carried the new fence posts, while Malene followed him with the roll of wire and the hammer. They spoke little, but the familiar rhythm returned, the constant back and forth of shared work. She bent down to hold the posts while he secured them. Her dress caught on something and rode up higher than it should have. He caught a glimpse of the curve of her thigh and the soft inside of her knee. He looked away immediately, his jaw stiff and his breathing slow. She noticed. In the afternoon, they rested under the only tree that still had leaves. They shared bread and jerky. The silence was not cold. It was now familiar. She pulled her knees up and adjusted her dress, resting her hands in her lap. When I was young, I dreamed of leaving here, she said. I thought I'd see St. Louis, or maybe Kansas City, places with brick streets and streetlights that don't flicker. You could still go, Kaide said. I don't want to anymore. He looked at her. She avoided his gaze. I thought a man would come and change everything, she said. That he would fix the roof, buy me boots, say what I wanted to hear. I didn't say much, she replied, finally looking at him. But you stayed that night, and something changed. They didn't speak after dinner. She washed the dishes in silence. He stoked the fire. She went into the bedroom and emerged wearing the only robe she had, thin and loose. It slipped off her shoulder. The neckline revealed one of her breasts. The fabric outlined her curves in the firelight. She didn't cover herself. He didn't stare, but he did look. He approached slowly and stopped by the fireplace. Would you like to sit with me? She asked. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. They sat shoulder to shoulder on a rug without touching each other. She wrapped herself in the quilt. He remained silent. I don't want to be afraid of this place, or of you, or of waking up alone again. I'm not leaving. Looking at him, she slowly moved her hand until it rested on his. It wasn't a grab or a test, it was an invitation. Cade looked down at his rough fingers, touching the softness of hers, turned his palm, and took her seriously. She took a deep breath, and he looked at her directly again. This time, his tired face looked more tender. His lips were slightly parted, and his chest rose slowly under his robe. He leaned over and kissed her slowly and gently. He pressed his hand firmly against her neck and caressed her jaw with his thumb. She allowed it. When they broke apart, she didn't speak. She rested her forehead on his shoulder and stayed there. They said no more that night, but the silence was no longer empty. Cade woke up to the slightest movement beside her. She opened her eyes slowly and became fully conscious. The fire was still burning, casting long shadows onto the log walls. The warmth of the night lingered between the blankets, and she was curled up next to him, breathing quietly with her bare arm resting on his chest. They hadn't spoken again after the kiss. They didn't need to. She had leaned over him and rested her head under his chin. When the fire went out, he got up and held out his hand to her. She took it. Barefoot and unhurried but certain, she followed him to the quiet bedroom, and they undressed slowly. She went first, sliding the robe off her shoulders with trembling fingers. Her figure was revealed little by little. First her soft belly, then her rounded hips, and finally the weight of her breasts. Cade did not rush. He looked at her with respect, not hunger. When his hands finally touched her skin, she did not shrink back. She just exhaled. What happened between them was neither impulsive nor hurried. It was slow, steady and silent, as if each gesture carried the promise not to hurt or abandon her. He touched her as if she were something fragile. She sought him out as if she had waited years for the right embrace, for an immeasurable moment. They didn't need to count. They were no longer a broken man and a lost widow in the middle of nowhere. They were two souls who had found each other without plan or noise. At dawn, Cade watched her sleep for a few moments. Her loosed hair covered the pillow in waves. The quilt had slipped down her back, revealing the line of her shoulder and the slight rise of her chest. He reached out and carefully pulled up the blanket, then got dressed in silence. He didn't want to disturb the peace. Outside, frost still covered the fence posts. The ground crunched under his boots as he went to feed the horse. He worked in silence, but his thoughts were anything but. None of this had been part of his plan. Not when he bought the land, not when he saw her barefoot in a barn. He had come here seeking solitude, to escape memories and live without ties because they always tore him apart. But now she was in the house, in his bed and in his thoughts, and he didn't think it was a mistake. When he returned, she was already standing up. She was dressed in a simple cream-colored muslin dress, and her hair was pulled back.
She was standing barefoot next to the stove. "I was going to light the fire," she said quietly. "I already did," he replied. She turned to him. Her eyes were no longer uncertain. They were still cautious, but no longer hidden. "I saw a hole in the fence this morning," she said. The shutter in the corner banged again. "You don't have to do everything today. I want to do it." He nodded and hung his coat on the hook near the door. As she moved away from the table, he approached her and gently placed his hand on her waist. She tensed for just a moment, then relaxed. "Did you sleep warmly enough last night?" he asked. She smiled slightly. She hadn't felt so warm in months. He tilted his head and brushed his lips once against her shoulder before stepping back. "I'll go to town tomorrow. I'll bring back more supplies." She hesitated. "Are you leaving me here alone?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "You're not afraid I'll leave?" "I'd know if you were." She looked at him with serious gray eyes. "I'm not leaving." He nodded. "I know." Later, they worked together again, but in a different kind of silence. She brushed his arm as she passed. He held the ladder for her when she reached the shutter. When her skirt caught and rode up slightly, he looked not with desire, but with something quieter, as if he was storing the image in his memory. At dusk, she sat down by the fire to brush her hair, and he watched her from the table. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "Not anymore. Why?"
She looked at him as she placed the brush in her lap. Because leaving means not staying long enough to see what something becomes. He nodded. And I want to see what this becomes. He got up, walked over to her, and took her hand. I'm not promising anything, he said. You don't have to, she replied. They stood together in the light of the fire, the silence full of understanding. She no longer needed to be rescued, and he no longer needed to be alone. They weren't just surviving, they had decided to stay.
She seemed more at home than they should have been, given how it all began. Finally, he asked the question he had been holding back for some time. No one ever came looking for you. She turned slightly. Not since he died, yes. I don't think anyone cared much. He left no debts, only silence. His family never wrote to us, and mine had disappeared. Are you sure? She put down the pan and faced him. If anyone was coming, she said, they would have arrived months ago. He nodded, but the knot in his stomach remained. Later he rode into town, just a short trip to buy some brown sugar. He left her again, trusting that she would still be there when he returned, and she was. When he came back, the yard had been swept, the porch had been cleared of leaves, and the shutter had finally been nailed down. But that wasn't what caught his attention. There was a stranger by the entrance, a thin man wearing a cheap brown coat and boots that were too polished for someone from the countryside. He was standing next to a mule tied to the fence, talking to it. Kaid stopped his horse. His eyes did not leave the stranger. He rode straight in and dismounted without a word. Malene saw him first. She stood alert, not frightened. She stood with her arms crossed and her shoulders tense. Everything okay? She asked, in a calm but firm voice. The man turned around. I don't want to cause any trouble. I just have a few questions. What kind of questions? The man smiled dryly. I carry cargo from Bastrop. Sometimes I carry mail through the northern mountains. I saw a notice posted in town. It was about a missing woman in this county. A man said that his sister-in-law had disappeared and that she might be dead or have been taken in by someone. The man looked at Malene. I saw her. I thought I'd ask her. She's not missing, said Kaide. She's here, that's all. The stranger raised his hands. I didn't mean to offend. It's just a message, not a judgment. You deliver it. Message received. That's as far as it goes. The man looked at Malene again, then left. Something unsaid remained between them, heavier than words. Then he mounted his mule and rode away. Kaid didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the horizon where the rider had disappeared. Then he turned to her. You knew this was coming. I figured it would someday. You're worried she'll come? He nodded. Not because he cared, but because he wanted to be in control. That house was never really hers. He always thought that when things got tough, she'd end up crawling back. She'll come with the law, not just words. And she's worthless now. He watched her calmly. She was steady and not afraid, but prepared. You're not going anywhere, Kid said. He's not taking you. She didn't respond verbally. Instead, she took a step towards him and rested her hand firmly and serenely on his chest. Their eyes met. I need to know you mean it. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't believe it.
That night, the cold felt harsher than it had all winter. Kide brought more wood and kept the fire burning brightly. Standing by the flames, she untangled her hair, her dress slipping slightly off one shoulder to reveal her pale skin. He sat down beside her, attentive to her every gesture. Have you ever thought about getting married again? He asked quietly. Not for years. And now you're thinking about it? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Yes." She didn't smile, she just nodded. "Don't expect too much from me," he added. "I'm not looking for too much," she replied. "Just someone to stay." The words hung heavy and true. She slowly rested her head on his chest, and he wrapped his arm around her. They stayed like that for a long time. They were no longer just two strangers or two broken souls sharing a roof. They were two people who had truly chosen each other. Outside, the wind blew, but the fire resisted. So did they inside. That same winter, the days suddenly grew shorter. The frost took longer to melt each morning, and the air cut through the skin at dusk. Kide started lighting another fire in the back room, and Milan, who had previously kept out of the way as a guest, now moved around the house as if she had always lived there. She cooked more hearty meals. He taught her how to mend leather. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. They shared everything naturally. Even if hours passed without speaking, there was no awkwardness. The space now belonged to them both. Nevertheless, the stranger's visit remained at the forefront of Kide's mind. She didn't mention it, but from that day on, she slept with the knife under her bed again. It wasn't because she expected a fight. It was because she knew men like the messenger's brother. Men who hated losing what they believed was theirs, even if they had never truly wanted it. Milan noticed her vigilance, though he never questioned it. One night by the woodpile, she asked him softly, "Do you think someone will come again?" He didn't lie. "It's possible." "And what would you do if Kid came?" She calmly adjusted the axe. "Whatever it takes to keep you here." She parted her lips lightly, moving closer until her fingers brushed the sleeve of his coat. "I've lived with men who said the same thing," she murmured, "but they only kept their word when it suited them." "I mean it," he replied, finding it difficult. Later, in the warmth of the cabin, Milan opened a drawer she had never touched before. Inside was a small, dented tin box. She opened it carefully. Inside was a simple silver ring worn by time. Cade saw it. "It was my mother's," he said from across the room. Medlin looked at him silently. He crossed to her, took the ring in his hand, and looked at her intently. "I never gave it to anyone." She didn't speak. "I didn't think I would," he added. She still didn't speak. "I don't have a preacher. I don't have a church. And I don't know what day it is." She took a step towards him. "But I have this house," she continued. "I have this land. And I have you." Madeline looked at the ring, then into his eyes. "Are you telling me something?" Cade whispered. He nodded. "Yes." She held out her hand, calmly and without tears. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a little big, but she didn't care. "I won't be perfect," she said. "Neither will I. I'll burn the bread some days and forget to fix things. I still wake up scared some nights." "I don't always sleep through the night either," she replied. They stayed like that for a long moment until she sank into his embrace. He held her tighter than ever. Her forehead rested on his chest, and his hand was firmly on her back. That night they shared the bed, not only as man and woman, but as something chosen. Their bodies sought each other slowly under the blankets, not out of necessity or relief, but out of certainty. When she whispered his name and he traced her curves, there was no fear. Later, with her head on his chest, she asked, "Do you believe in new beginnings?" He breathed in the scent of her hair. Now he did. Outside, the wind blew dry leaves against the porch. Inside, the house resisted the wind, too.
That night the wind roared, banging furiously on the shutters, but the fire burned steadily and the walls remained firm. Cade and Madeline slept together under the blanket, her head on his shoulder and her hand on his side. Neither of them spoke for a long time, but there was no need to. The silence was filled with certainty. At dawn, the blizzard had calmed down, and frost covered the yard.
Cade got up first, put on his boots, and went outside. The icy air cut into his lungs, but it was clean. He took a deep breath and looked back at the house. From the outside, the patched roof, repaired windows, and sturdy barn appeared humble. The old door hung crookedly, but it was now in use and no longer abandoned. Merlin appeared on the porch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her hair was loose and her face was reddened by the cold. Her bare feet peeped out from under the fabric. The silver ring sparkled in the early morning light. He turned to her. "I was thinking we should go to town," he said. "Today?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, we need seeds for planting, medicine, and maybe another blanket." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "And maybe we should let people know about the ring, about you and me." There was a brief silence. Their white breath escaped into the cold air. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. She took a step forward until she was almost touching him. "Then I suppose it's time." They entered the village in the late afternoon.
The mare was pulling the cart that I had repaired the week before. It was rough, but it held up. Malign walked beside him, wrapped in her coat and wearing oversized gloves. During the journey, she glanced at the silver ring on her finger once. Then she turned her gaze forward, holding her chin high. When they arrived at Bridger's stand, people couldn't help but stare. Cade was already waiting for him. He hadn't returned to town with a woman on his arm since before the war. Malign, once known as the barefoot barn widow, now walked with a firm step, her shoulders straight, her hair pulled back, and her ring clearly visible. As they entered the general store, the murmuring died down. Cade nodded to the clerk. "Flour, salt, oil, and seeds. We're planting next month." The clerk looked at Malign and then at Cade. "That'll be almost," he began, then blinked. "Put it on my tab," he said. As they gathered what they needed, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Well, I'll be damned!" It came from the back. It was Tom Mercer, Cade's older, louder cousin on his father's side, who never knew when to shut up. He looked Malign up and down and smirked. "Didn't know you had company, Cade." Cade didn't respond. Tom moved a little closer and nodded towards Malign. "So she's the one everyone's been talking about, the one who stayed at Branson's barn all summer. I heard you was tough and settled in pretty well." Malign tensed. Cade turned to face his cousin. "You got something to say? Say it to my face." He spoke in a low, even voice. Tom raised his hands. "Easy, man. I just didn't expect you to bring her in like she was your property." "She is." Tom's smile faded. "Well, okay then." Kate looked away until Tom backed off, muttered something, and disappeared between the shelves. Later, as they loaded the wagon, Malign stayed by his side, saying little, but her hand sought his and squeezed it tightly. They returned as the sun was setting. She leaned against him, her breath warmer than the wind, and her presence as steady as a root. When they reached the cabin, Kate stopped the wagon near the porch, looked at her, and said quietly, "If you ever want to leave this place, I won't stop you. But I'd rather you stayed." Malign looked at him for a long time with steady eyes.
"I don't want to leave," she replied. "Not this house, not this land, not you." He nodded, unable to trust his own voice. That night, with the fire crackling and the wind blowing outside, they sat opposite each other at the table. Without a cure or witnesses, he reached out and took her hand and whispered, "But I still stand by what I asked of you."
She stood up, walked around the table, and sat on his lap, hugging his neck. He kissed her again, more slowly this time, as if that gesture belonged to the earth itself as something permanent. Over the following weeks, the house changed. He put together another bed, she put up shelves, he carved her name on the inside of the doorframe next to his. By spring, a second horse occupied the stable, and a chicken coop had been built by the fence. The land was still hard work, but the silence between them never returned. What had begun with a barn and a woman without a destination had become something solid and impossible to shake. It was not perfect or easy, but it was chosen every day. And when people passed by the gate, they no longer whispered. They said, "There's the Mercer farm." No one dared to ask why she stayed.